main character took the collar of his clothes off his mouth and grinned, asking himself if he should say hello now. Theodore waved his hand in the air, and a bright pattern in the form of a circle with a cross inside appeared on the sand. Thick blue smoke appeared around, among which humanoid creatures were visible with a loud roar. The creatures that filled the area straightened up and moved in one direction. The main character stood with both hands raised up, and the sand monsters that appeared moved according to his order. The two men who were watching what was happening were horrified and assumed that it was summoning magic. Theodore shouted, ordering everyone to calm down, and explained that these creatures were summoned by him so they would not cause any harm to the people around them. The main character loudly ordered his puppets to protect his group and said that this order would remain in effect until there were no enemies left within a kilometer radius. The creatures responded monotonously that they would immediately carry out Theodore's order without any objections. The main character frowned and thought that he did not feel any anxiety at all, unlike other opponents he had fought before. Theodore raised his palm, in which a bright flame had accumulated, and came to the conclusion that the local robbers were no more dangerous than a stone in the middle of the road. The main character raised his hand up, and 4 fiery attacks soared into the air, lighting up the night sky. Theodore was sweating with excitement because he didn't understand how he was able to create 4 attacks if he used mana that should only be enough for 2. Looking at the glowing symbol on his palm, the protagonist assumed that this was the power of the Ring of Muspelheim. Theodore concluded that this would not hinder him much, and he just needed to calculate the power of the ring and add it to the formula, and then created fire between his 2 palms. The main character put his hands in front of him, directing the blow. The next moment, fiery attacks resembling fireworks tore through the sky. In an instant, many of Theodore's fiery attacks sparkled in the air. The robbers, whose faces were hidden behind black cloth and red glasses, spoke loudly to each other in a foreign language, shocked by the magic of the main character. The fiery attacks were directly in front of the robber, who walked ahead of everyone and was presumably their leader. When the man riding a camel rushed forward, the main character became convinced that these robbers knew how to use aura. Several of the bandits were struck by Theodore's attacks like lightning, and they jumped from the backs of their camels. The main character, whose pistol-shaped palms were smoking, concluded that the robbers definitely did not expect this. One of the robbers quickly rode a camel towards Theodore, at the same time shouting loudly and aggressively. The main character jumped to the side, took out a long sword and threw it over his shoulder. Theodore then leapt over his opponent and raised his weapon, preparing to strike. The robber, whose face was hidden, but a red light was shining from the eye slits, loudly shouted wishes for death to the main character. Theodore fell to the ground with a loud sound, raising columns of dust and sand around him. The protagonist opened his eyes wide and loudly shouted, "Song of Battle, Rhapsody of Power," while a bright flash of light gathered in his palm. Theodore bent down, clenched his hands into fists, and rushed to attack the enemy again. The shockwave was rapidly approaching a man dressed in black riding a camel, who had a dark cloth draped over his head. The man was riding leisurely and hanging from the saddle when, in the middle of the dust, he saw the immobilized bodies of his comrades. The man, completely covered in black clothing, raised his index finger up and made a circle in the air. A man in the same clothes, sitting on a camel with a bridle in his hands, nodded in response to this gesture. Theodore stood with his fists raised in front of him as 4 bandit riders surrounded him. The main character, sweat streaming down his face from fatigue, was stunned that the man gave the signal for the cordon with just one movement of his hand. When one of the robbers took off his mask and said that Theodore was very skillful for his age, the young man recognized in this speech the official language of the North. A man with bright green eyes and a scar on his nose said that it was time for the main character to leave the games because he believed too much in his abilities and would end up dead if he continued to resist. When Theodore asked if the robbers would spare him if he surrendered now, the man confirmed this and explained that their goal was to take everything valuable, then receive a ransom, and if the main character surrendered now, he would soon go home. The main character grinned, looked at his interlocutor with impudence in his eyes, and asked why he should believe the robber's words. When one of the robbers, enraged by Theodore's words, shouted that he was still too young to understand how much one should value his own life, but another robber stopped him. The main character looked at the people around him and said with a smile that they were better suited to be called not bandits, but janissaries or a squad of army bloodhounds. The robber with green eyes and a scar on his nose furrowed his eyebrows and opened his mouth in shock, looking at Theodore. While the main character's cloak fluttered in the wind, he pulled the collar of his clothes away from his neck and said with a stern face that ordinary bandits could not have such a level of military training. The protagonist with a cold look asked if he could consider that their robbery was approved by the Sultan himself, because the janissaries are also known as the swords of the Sultan. The man pursed his lips and frowned, looking at the main character with wide open eyes. The man stated that he had no idea what Theodore was talking about, for he was not part of the janissaries, and his subordinates were not part of any unit. The man reached for the weapon behind his back, saying that they were just bandits who had no names or honor, and they were simply profiting from the merchants who came their way. The man waved his sword in the air and screamed piercingly that now the main character would meet his death at the hands of some simple robbers. Theodore bent his knees and fingers, saying that in this case he would accept his fate and leave gracefully. The main character used the earth-breaking technique, and the bandits who surrounded him were thrown up along with their camels from the shockwave. The animals became frightened and screamed, as did their riders, who fell from their backs. The leader of the robbers grinned tensely and cursed loudly, insulting the main character. Theodore raised his head and shouted, asking the wind to become his sword. Sand flew in the air while the main character used ancient magic, which was called a storm of blades. Stone humanoid monsters, controlled by the main character, fought with bandits in the middle of the desert. One dark-eyed robber pulled an arrow onto the bowstring, taking careful aim. The arrow hit the hand of one of Theodore's soldiers and cut it in two. Several robbers galloped with lightning speed to the wounded creature, which was already preparing to attack. The creature's hand began to gradually split into small fragments with a loud crack. The next second there was an explosion, and the robbers and their animals jumped up. A man in beige clothes with light brown hair watched from afar as the desert was engulfed in a fog of dust and sand due to the battle. The head of the Flonal Guild, named Gord Flonal, raised his palm to his forehead, watching the battle with admiration and stunnedness at the same time. The man looked at Theodore's warriors and thought that he had seen living armor before, but this was the first time he had seen such powerful armor. Gord assumed that the main character had summoned living armor using that bracelet, and thought that he could try to buy back this useful artifact. When Gord put his hand on his waist and sighed heavily, Theodore, standing next to him with his hands in his pockets, asked what was the matter. Gord turned around, waved and greeted the protagonist, saying that an unexpected sandstorm had just occurred. Theodore laughed awkwardly and said that it was one of the robbers who was using some kind of artifact. Gord, thinking about the danger of the artifact, with a face full of excitement, asked what happened to the robbers. When the main character replied that he had finished off several of them who were caught in the storm, Gord asked in surprise whether the young man had dealt with the enemies alone, and Theodore confirmed this. The main character felt awkward when Gord said that the storm might have weakened the robbers, but the fact that Theodore dealt with them and thanks to him the merchants could live another day was truly impressive. Theodore laughed and said that they were just lucky, although he thought that in fact the robbers fought for the glory of the Sultan until their last breath. The main character reflected that due to the disaster in the Kingdom of Austin, the drought forced the military, like these janissaries, to stoop to robbery for the sake of the future of their kingdom and people. Theodore raised his head, pulled the cloth over his chin and sighed exhaustedly. Looking at the bright constellation in the sky, the main character wondered if he himself was at least in any way different from these janissaries. In the middle of a desert area with golden sand, a small city could be seen. The main character sat in the carriage with a hat on his head and the lower half of his face covered and silently looked out the window. Theodore arrived in the trading kingdom of Kargas, a border city called Sapporo. The main character turned around when Gord, who was in the role of coachman, said that he did not expect an ambush near the border. However, this confirmed that the rumors about refugees from the Kingdom of Austin becoming bandits were true. The carriage kicked up dust around itself as Gord explained that the severe drought was to blame. The man said that the price of water had increased tenfold, and influential families had fled to other cities, causing people to go mad. Gord said that he and Theodore were prohibited from entering the Kingdom of Austin for some time. The main character lowered the cloth from his mouth and advised Gord to hire more guards before he went back, and he himself reflected that immigrants who became robbers could still be understood, but not entire military units who descended to robbery. Theodore came to the conclusion that other continents should not yet know about the current situation, and if the identities of the bandits become known to the public, the Kingdom of Austin will declare that their reputation is being tarnished, and then the situation will take on a global scale. The carriage creaked to a stop. When Theodore left the carriage saying that he would stop at Sapporo, Gord took off his hat, stunned that the main character was already leaving. The man closed his eyes with a smile and said that he could not let their virtue go empty-handed, and he needed to be thanked somehow for his help. Gord handed Theodore a palm containing small, rectangular wooden objects with carved designs. The main character arched his eyebrows warily and asked what it was. Gord smiled, raised his index finger, and explained that the guild gives 2 of these tokens to merchants who reach a certain rank, and one of them confirms identity. When the main character asked about the second token, Gord said with a warm smile that if you show this token to anyone in the guild, Theodore will be treated like a leader, providing him with free carriages, interest-free loans, and much more. Theodore asked incredulously who would be responsible for this, and Gord poked his finger in the chest with a confident smile, saying that whoever gave the tokens was responsible. When the main character opened his mouth in shock and widened his eyes, asking if Gord was serious, the man burst out laughing and replied that he fully vouched for all of Theodore's actions. Then Gord put his fist on his side and with a smile, as if by chance, asked if the main character would sell him that same bracelet. Theodore immediately understood why Gord did not take his eyes off the artifact, and with a smile he raised his hand with the bracelet in front of him. The system reported that this artifact belongs to the class of treasures, and when absorbing the item, one can obtain a huge supply of magical power. The system also informed that digestion would take 4 days, and that this was the maximum information available for level 4. Gord winked and said that he would pay 100 gold for the bracelet, persuading Theodore to sell the artifact. The main character awkwardly scratched the back of his head and explained that he himself had borrowed a bracelet from another person, so he had no right to sell someone else's property, and Gord, adjusting his hat, said that in this case nothing could be done. The main character thought that this bracelet was created by the Lord of the Amber Tower, Norden, and since this artifact is capable of summoning living armor, its cost should be far beyond 100 gold. Gord raised his hat, telling Theodore to take care of himself on the road, and the protagonist waved to the man, wishing him the same in return. The main character raised his hand and broke into a sincere smile, saying goodbye to Gord. Then Theodore lowered his hand and turned away abruptly, saying that it was time for him to move out. In the middle of a kingdom with dark and deserted buildings, black crows flew. Theodore walked along the narrow street, avoiding people in brown cloaks and animals. The main character watched passers-by. Theodore thought that in the border city of Sapporo of the Karga's kingdom, the atmosphere is quite calm, although there are many foreigners. The main character stopped. Theodore looked down the alley and wondered if this was the place Canis was talking about. According to Canis, the Information Guild is in the business of selling information, and the Mouse King is the best among their ranks. Theodore used the hawk's eye technique and peered into the alley. Theodore looked at the wooden door and thought that in heroic epics and fairy tales, in order to enter a room that is usually underground, the main character usually needs to say some kind of password. But in fact, the likelihood is that the guild will not mark its location on the map is very small. The main character moved forward, counting 6 steps after the 3rd pillar and 3 more steps from the old sign. Theodore concluded that he had come to the right place. The main character knocked on the wooden door while a fog of dust rose behind him. The main character opened the door to a spacious room that looked abandoned. Theodore walked forward through the rising dust. The man with a scar under his eye, dressed in a black cloak, looked hostile. A man with eyes glowing with red light sat, intertwining his fingers, and together with his comrade silently watched what was happening. Theodore saw a girl in black clothes in the distance and asked her if he was now in the Sapporo Information Guild. A muscular girl with red eyes, black hair, and a scar on her face looked at the intruder with interest. Theodore, standing in a room with wooden spans, covered himself with his collar from the rising dust and looked in bewilderment at the muscular girl in front of him, not understanding why he was called an uninvited guest. The brunette sitting in front of the guy turned out to be the leader of the Mouse King Guild named Jibra, who, after looking at the stranger, calmly concluded that he was not their sponsor and not even local. Putting her finger to her lip, the woman said with curiosity that judging by the tone and style of the young man's clothing, he was from the north, or more precisely from Melter. Theodore was shocked, wondering how Gabra knew this information, and she said that she has her own methods, which is to determine information from small details. The woman looked piercingly at the guy with red eyes, with a malicious grin, saying that she was unlikely to identify a good spy, but the rest would not be able to hide. Glancing at his interlocutor with excitement, the guy concluded that she had a keen eye, and stated that she lived up to the name of the guild, confirming all her words about him. Crossing her legs, the woman with an imposing look asked where Theodore knew about their organization, and he replied that he received this information from a smuggler named Canis. Hearing this name, the woman closed her eyes and asked with dissatisfaction whether this fool was really still alive, because after leaving for Melter there was no news from her. Theodore was amazed that the guild leader knew the girl, not understanding why she was so angry, and Jibber continued to grumble with displeasure, declaring that they had met with Canis a couple of times, and the smuggler, despite her professionalism, turned out to be a coward. The woman extended her hand, which was covered with a long fingerless glove, in greeting of the intruder. She smiled friendly, closing her eyes, and said that in any case, she was glad to meet you, introducing herself as the head of the Information Guild branch in Sapporo. Shaking Jibber's hand, Theodore told her the short form of his name, and she with a smile clarified what brought him to them. The guy cast a sly glance at his interlocutor, declaring that he wanted to find something in Kargas. She slightly closed her eyes, curiously clarifying what exactly interests him. The main character, with a serious look, explained that he had arrived here in order to ask the guild to buy back information about the location of the originals and their owners living in Kargas, adding that the condition of the book should be acceptable, and if the price corresponds to the quality, then Jibber will receive a bonus. After listening to the guy, the woman with a sly look said that if he was talking about original copies of magic books, then such purchases would cost a tidy sum. Theodore, a little nervous, clarified how much it would cost, and the guild leader extended her hand with 3 raised fingers, saying that she would ask for 30 gold pieces as a contribution, separately counting the price for the time spent. After that, Jibra looked at her hand in bewilderment and put out her index finger on her other hand, trying to count accurately. A moment later, the woman again assumed an imposing pose, scratching the back of her head, and asked to forget about her words, since she would not be able to fulfill this request, and then Theodore began to ask in bewilderment whether it was about money. Rising from her seat and turning away from her interlocutor, Jibra folded her arms across her chest with dissatisfaction and said that this was not the case, because the guy's request promised good earnings for the guild, but he came at the wrong time. Having sat down with the woman at a wooden table with a red stripe, Theodore repeated what he had heard, to which the woman replied that since the guy was from the north, he could not know about Karga's life. The woman gave the guy a serious look as she told him about the massive auction, which was an annual event that was set to begin in a couple of days, and rumor had it that the amount of money being put into it was equal to the kingdom's annual budget. Confused by this information, the main character clarified how the auction was related to his request. As the woman pulled her finger to her lip and looked down, she said with a thoughtful look that the auction was a place where the seller could get the highest price for his goods, and after this event it would take months to fulfill the guest's request. Throwing a disappointed look at his interlocutor, Theodore pondered her words about the auction, deciding that he should attend this large-scale event. Look in the other direction with slightly closed eyes, the guy was thinking that he could find the owners in advance and convince them to sell the books, but they would sell the goods to auctioneers more willingly than to a person who came from nowhere, so Jibra is right that this is not the most suitable time. With his hands folded, the guy had already decided that it was too early to give up, because there was another way to solve the problem. After that, he turned to the head of the guild, asking with a serious look what if he went to the auction himself, and the interlocutor replied that the first person he met would not be allowed in there because of the huge budget of the kingdom concentrated there. Theodore lifted his sand-colored cloak slightly, taking out a valuable item. When the woman recognized the item belonging to the Flonal Guild, the guy confirmed her guess with a sly smile. Then she looked down with a thoughtful look, not understanding how the young man was able to get the token of the head of the guild at such a young age, and Theodore said that, unfortunately, he could not tell her the details. The guild leader said that the token was more than enough for entry, and then beckoned the guy closer with her index finger, daring to ask one question. Jibra cast a piercing glance at her interlocutor, asking in a serious tone whether he was really going to participate in the auction. Turning away from the woman, Theodore confirmed his intentions with an awkward look, thinking that he already had little time, so he was not going to sit out for months. After this statement, the woman's lips spread into a satisfied grin, and she thoughtfully scratched her chin. Winking at her interlocutor, the brunette with a scar on her face accepted his request with a good-natured smile, informing him that from now on she would call him employer. Still in the same spacious hall with numerous flights of wooden stairs and high windows through which sunlight broke through, Jibra said that now she needed to know the details. Leaning on his hands, Theodore looked questioningly at his interlocutor, and she explained that she needed information about his budget because at an auction it is important to promote your goods, but money decides everything there. Taking a thoughtful pose, the main character closed his eyes and said that he had about 500 gold, thinking in his mind that if this was not enough, then he could go beyond the budget. Stunned by the figure she heard, Jibra decisively stated that if the customer had met a little earlier, her guild would have bought up all the originals in the country. With her hands on her knees, the woman from the mountains beat and said that everything was in order with the budget, asking if Theodore wanted anything other than books. The main character's dark bangs fell on his face, and he answered with a serious look that the originals were enough for him. I even allowed the guild to overpay for them. The most important thing was to get as many copies as possible. The satisfied woman closed her eyes, realizing that for the employer, quantity exceeds quality, and after snapping her fingers, a subordinate approached her with a box in his hands. Jibra took out a map from there and, spreading it on the table, stated that the auction would begin in 4 days and would be held independently in each of the places marked on the paper, and Theodore listened attentively. Looking at the map, the main character concluded that there would be several auctions at once. Let them look down. The woman explained that each marker contains a certain type of product, so you need to find out everything in advance. Auctions in Kargas are usually held in the north, south, west, and east. In the east they sell weapons and armor, in the west, clothes, in the south, jewelry and decorations, and in the north, in turn, they sell everything that was not previously specified, and that's where you need to go. Looking carefully at the map, she explained that there would be 3 auctions in total, and, unlike the others, they did not boast about their quality and prices, but the number of goods they sold was truly amazing. When Theodore began to think that the auction in the north of the kingdom would require too much travel time, he asked if they could visit other auctions. I put my hand to my chest. Jibra said that this can be done with the Flonal Guild token, which allows you to participate in auctions with 3 agents. Glancing at the employer, she said with a sovereign look that with informants from the guild he would instantly find the originals. Slightly closing his eyes, Theodore thought, concluding that the people of the Information Guild should really know a lot about this. Leaning Leaning with one hand on the table, the head of the guild stated that with 3 auctions the budget should be approximately at the same level as mentioned earlier. I now decide to deal with the most important event, and Theodore looked questioningly at his interlocutor. Gibra explained with a smile that there is a central auction, which is the largest of all and contains all the listed goods. But agents will not be allowed there, because only people with a pass are allowed to be in this place, so Theodore will be on his own. Interested in the prospect of attending an underground auction, the protagonist broke into a devious grin. Crossing her arms over her chest, the woman lowered her head and promised that she would do her best. Afterwards, the brunette with a scar on her face raised her head, casting a questioning glance at her interlocutor and clarifying where he would live. After this question, Theodore put his hand to his chin and turned away slightly, indicating that he had not even thought about it. Suddenly, a good idea came to the guy's head. With an awkward laugh, he turned to the leader of the guild, asking if she had any place in mind for tourists. Gibra clenched her fist, greatly indignant at this question, and wanted to hit the guy if he weren't the employer. Night was already falling over dusty Kargas, and several stars sparkled in the sky, and the woman swore dissatisfiedly, after which she decided to show one place for tourists. It was now a clear day over the cities, and the rays of the sun illuminated the semicircular roofs of buildings, and a flock of would-be a raven. The flock, together with a man from the guild, in a dusty wooden building. Theodore thought that 3 days had passed since the meeting with Gibra, and during that time he had traveled all over the kingdom. As it turns out, Kargas is not famous for its attractions, but the tricks of the trade here are quite tempting and worth spending your time on. Watching passers-by on the dusty street, Theodore held his collar and thought about how long he would have to wait for the abandoned goods. Many blackbirds soared over the city, and the guy concluded that knowing the deadline would not shorten the wait. The action moves to a room with a carpet on the floor, and there is now a small brown bag on the table right in front of the main character. Sitting on the sofa with his hands down, Theodore asked the guild member what he had brought him, to which the man replied that this was the goods that the head of the department had asked to deliver. When Gibra's subordinate got up from his seat, and the young man, who had believed all this time that it was almost impossible to get the originals, was surprised at such a quick discovery, clarified whether the original books were really in front of him. When the guild member began to leave, Theodore waved after him and asked him to convey his gratitude to Gibra, and the man, waving back and assuring that the request would be fulfilled, went about his business. The opening of an auction house does not mean that all goods will be put up for auction, because there are people who prefer other methods, and these include opponents of auctions or those who are in a hurry to get rid of something. Deciding to check the delivered goods, the guy began to untie the brown bag on the table. Imposingly throwing his crossed legs onto the table, Theodore began to carefully examine the books and read the titles on the covers, among which were Gentle Breeze, Heating Magic for Dummies, Principles of Amplification Magic. Continuing to look at the received goods, the main character gloomily concluded that all these books are useful only for beginners, noting that this is the first time he sees ordinary in the description of the original book. Theodore cast a puzzled glance at the last book with a mustard cover, trying to understand what was in front of him. The book was enveloped in a soft blue glow, and a turquoise tablet appeared that Theodore was holding in his hands a work called Summoning the Rift, which contains knowledge about the magic of summoning creatures from the intangible world. Information also appeared that the author, Saint Tomer, refused to acknowledge the extinction of the magic of summoning and went to unknown lands. And there, in one of the most sinister places, he wrote this book, but, unfortunately, died before he could complete a high-level summoning spell. The last tablet reported that Theodore's level of understanding was very high, that the book was of a rare class, and when absorbed, the understanding of summoning magic would increase significantly. The main character, looking at the mustard cover with curiosity, chuckled contentedly, because the front one was a rare original. Without taking his eyes off the book, he thought that summoning magic had long been looked down upon and considered a relic of the past. All the wizards on the continent have long forgotten how to summon earth giants or ice dragons, content with middle-class magical entities. Thinking about whether this book would be of any use, the guy concluded with irritation that he could not help himself because the designated deadline was approaching, but he was complaining about food for the magical grimoire. Still sitting on the couch, Theodore informed Gluttony that today's lunch would be a book called Summoning the Rift. The guy called the grimoire, and it began to grow from his palm. Hearing his master's call, Gluttony looked at Theodore in anticipation of the original, sticking out his tongue like a dog. With a malicious grin, bringing his palm glowing with blue energy to the original, the main character wished the magical grimoire bon appetit. A turquoise tablet appeared and said that Theodore had absorbed the principles of amplification magic, adding that the book's understanding was very high. There was also information that the original copy had been absorbed, but the soul fragment contained in the book was too weak, so synchronization was not possible. The next small sign explained that the fragment would be absorbed into the user's soul. Blinded by the bright blue flash, Theodore frowned deeply, having never eaten regular script before, so he didn't know if they really absorbed in this way. Signs that popped up informed of an increase in understanding of summoning magic, while a whirlwind rising from powerful energy shook Theodore's hair. The system decided to check the possibility of synchronization with the essence of the author, after which it confirmed it and learned part of St. Tomer's skills. The last turquoise sign announced that synchronization was beginning. Dusk was gathering outside the window when a strange sound was heard in the room with numerous books scattered on the table. The narrative shifts to a book Theodore is engrossed in, where a fair-haired man is leaning on a table reading an old manuscript. Hanging down, he began to sigh loudly. Flasks, and magical cauldrons were placed on shelves throughout the room. Clenching his hand into a fist, the man complained about life. Leaning his hands on the table, the magician slid down and fell to his knees in despair. Covering his face with his shoulder, the unknown man held his head with his hand while tears flowed from his eyes in streams. A sudden sound behind him disturbed the researcher, and he suddenly opened his eyes. This desperate man was the first ever summoner of St. Tomer, who, with his back turned, hastily wiped the tears from his face. Based on the recording, already in his time the potential of summoning magic came to a standstill, and the author of the book died early due to accumulated fatigue and poisoning during the journey. And now he turned around towards the sounds, noticing Theodore shrouded in a blue haze in his laboratory. St. Tosno looked in amazement at the young man who arrived. After that, he went straight to the stranger, angrily asking if the young man had also come to ridicule him. After these accusations, Theodore looked at the man in front of him with bewilderment. I don't understand why he sees him. St. Tomer suddenly started shouting, demanding the guy not to pretend that he had not come to plunge him into the mud. Pulling back his blue robe, St. Tomer yelled that he understood Theodore, who was a magician of the 6th circle, because he was much better than himself, who remained a magician of the 5th circle until his death. Clenching his fist, the author of the book shouted with a pitiful look, does the young man really not want to ask him for wisdom, but is only trying to ridicule him? When St. Tomer finally fell silent, Theodore declared that the master had misunderstood him. Hearing such an address, the man declared that he was no master, to which the main character extended his hand and explained that he could not come up with a suitable address, and if the researcher was uncomfortable, then he could use another one. Sitting down on the floor and throwing the edge of his robe back, St. Tomer declared that the young man was funny and said that he did not care about appeals. Looking down, the man thoughtfully asked why a 20-year-old boy who had reached the 6th circle would come to a loser like him for knowledge. The standing Theodore assured that the gentleman was not a loser, to which St. Tomer demanded to stop comforting him. Looking around, the main character suggested that if a man read his memories, he should know that he possesses a grimoire. I look up at my interlocutor with a tired look. St. Tomer decided that Theodore decided to show off his success in this way. After these words, Theodore told a story about how he once asked the grimoire why summoning magic was weaker than others and why in myths and legends it was false, which greatly interested the author of the book. The young man explained, and that the reason why this magic, when used, cannot reveal its full potential does not lie in the magic itself. He began to talk about how during the end of the era of myths the barrier between dimensions became stronger. Because of this it became much more difficult to summon creatures from other dimensions or borrow their power, citing historical data as an example. After the story, St. Tomer closed his eyes and chuckled slightly. He raised his head up and burst into mad laughter, and Theodore tried to call out to him. The man, with a joyful laugh, finally understood what was the matter and why the creatures did not answer his call, concluding that correcting the magic circles was a futile exercise. Continuing to laugh, St. Tomer shouted with enthusiasm that he was not mistaken and his research was not a failure, coming to the conclusion that his magic and his hopes were not fruitless. Putting his hand on the floor, the man sadly recalled how many years he spent on research. He glanced sideways at the object next to him. I concluded that it wasn't even funny anymore. Theodore anxiously asked if the gentleman was okay. Leaning his head on his fist, the man turned to Miller and thought. Tomer, pointing his finger forward, asked if the young man could do this, but Theodore did not understand what was being said. Then, raising his closed eyes, Tomer with a dreamy look explained that he was asking whether the guy could accomplish what he himself could not do during his lifetime. After such a serious question, Theodore, confused, began to mumble. Rising from the floor, the researcher said that he was thinking about how to break the wall between dimensions, but the dead man was clearly powerless in such a matter. Hitting the guy on the chest with his fist, Tomer seriously stated that he intended to entrust Theodore with his dream. He looked good-naturedly at the young man, promising that he would receive all the knowledge he had accumulated over many years, after which he announced that he was leaving the dream to him. Hearing this, Theodore became embarrassed. Then the inspired author of the book gave a hint with a chuckle, declaring that there was no other way out but to break the barrier or create a portal, thereby neutralizing the effect of the barrier. Throwing a piercing look at Theodore, St. Tomer said that he already had a similar one in him. He just needed to use summoning magic through the portal, and then the young man would be able to go back 1,000,000 years ago and successfully summon a godlike creature. The black tentacles of the grimoire began to surround Theodore when he, with his eyes closed, admired the solution to the most difficult problem, and the author of the book also asked him to take with him when moving the bird that had entered into a contract with him. Suddenly, the grimoire wrapped itself around the protagonist's body and pulled him back, causing the guy to bare his teeth. When the black barrier began to close, St. Tomer said goodbye to his guest, and then noted that it was not proper for the dead to say goodbye. A pop-up sign from the system reported that synchronization with the entity of the author of the book was successfully completed. Information also appeared that Theodore received a contract from the entity of St. Tomer, offering to summon a minion using a summoning spell with a line from the contract. A new ability was added to the Ring of Muspelheim, which the system also notified the magician about. It was night on the narrow streets of Kargas. Black crows were flying on the strip of sky visible between the houses. While Theodore and Gabra stood in a dark alley, a merchant accosted the guy, obsessively inviting him to look at him, and the woman glanced sideways at the bald stranger. Suddenly there was a loud cry demanding to make way, and the confused young man looked towards the source of the sound, putting his hand on the intrusive dark guy's chest to silence him. A stately man with blonde hair and a mustache, dressed in a massive kavak, caught his eye on Theodore. When horses and a carriage were walking along the road, kicking up dust, a scream was heard in the street, announcing the arrival of an agent of the Orcus Guild. Two carriages with horses stopped, getting lost in the clouds of dust that rose in the street. On the white flag peeking out from the haze, the yellow coat of arms of the Orcus Guild could be seen. This guild, from which the agent in Kavak has now arrived, is one of the 3 largest guilds in the Middle East. Its representatives are richer than the royal family, according to rumors. Looking at the growing crew, Theodore drooped, and for him it was unthinkable. He turned to Gibra, concluding with a gloomy expression that the guild agent was not a pleasant person, since he was traveling through the central square in a carriage, and even with such an escort. Watching the passing carriage, the woman chuckled thoughtfully, and then warned the young man to watch his words. He looked at his interlocutor with bewilderment, not understanding why Gabra, being the head of the Information Guild branch, was so afraid of them. The woman cast an alarmed glance at the guy, declaring that Orcus was not just some guild with a lot of gold, and if he continued to speak so unflatteringly about them, he would easily get into trouble. As the agent's entourage stood waiting in front of the couple, Theodore asked the woman to tell him more, and she stated that the information had nothing to do with the mission. After this, the head of the Information Guild department turned to the main character, taking the coin right out of his hands, which made him perplexed. Gibra, who winked, grinned, glad that the young man had money. When Theodore began to glare at his interlocutor, I asked him to listen carefully, clarifying that they themselves were not sure of the reliability of this information. The main character looked very alarmed when he learned that people who arrived from the Middle East used telepathy with the help of an aura. Gibra told Theodore that Orcus was founded about 30 years ago, which was a ridiculous time frame. The guild came out of nowhere and at first occupied only a small share of the market. Now they have grown and become almost the most influential guild of the entire central continent. The unexpected growth attracted the attention of the Information Guild, so its members decided to infiltrate their ranks in order to find out all the ins and outs. However, none of the spies returned alive. Closing her eyes, Gibra Ambush reported that they were all professionals in their field and could have avoided even the Master of the Sword, but they were still able to be eliminated, so now the Information Guild decided not to interfere in the affairs of Orcus. Theodora concluded that they had given up, but the woman objected, saying that they still managed to obtain some superficial information, and this is how an interesting pattern was discovered. She stated that anyone who conflicted with the guild over profit was sooner or later killed, but not at the hands of mercenaries, but at the hands of traitors who were previously considered friends. Theodore thought about what was said with alarm, horrified that people were dying from sudden illness, accidents, and also from the betrayal of loved ones. He furrowed his brows, concluding that at first glance it might seem that the guild had nothing to do with it, but something still pointed to them. This evidence is magic, capable of causing terrible diseases, bringing misfortune and misfortune, poisoning the hearts of those unfortunate people who became its victims. It was concluded that this was witchcraft prohibited by the magical community called black magic. Theodore chuckled thoughtfully, not taking his eyes off the moving carriage. He decided that he would be careful with the Orcus Guild. Gibra and the young man were now returning back, passing through narrow streets filled with dust. The woman's blonde subordinate cordially greeted the head of the department. Opposite Gibra and Theodore stood an employee of the Archon department in a voluminous cape and hat, who smiled when the boss noted that he had arrived on time. Realizing that the guys did not know each other, the leader introduced them to each other. Throwing an admiring glance at Archon, Theodore said that he was pleased to meet you. Closing his eyes, the blonde young man responded with a smile to his employer. Archon began to quickly move away in a narrow alley, turning to the boss and the magician, because there was no point in standing still, and they decided to catch up with him. Now the department employee was talking to a tall, bald jock, and he was animatedly explaining something to him. The big man looked menacingly at the hatted guild member, declaring that a special event was being held at their gambling house. Baring his teeth, the man looked at Archon with a mad look and said that only those who have an invitation can go out. When Theodore wanted to intervene, declaring that they had the right to participate in the auction, the blonde youth with a smirk threatened him with his finger, asking him to wait. Lowering his head, Arkin hid his face behind the wide brims of his hat and said menacingly that the oak tree guard was very funny. Something between a grin and a sarcastic smile appeared on his face, and the guild employee clarified whether the big man was ready to take responsibility for his words. Arkin sarcastically concluded that at this time, the only special event held here is an auction. Beginning to panic greatly, the bald man broke out in a cold sweat and began to make excuses that he was only following the orders given to him. Unobtrusively showing the big man the token of the Vogel Guild, Arkin, with a feigned good-natured smile, threateningly clarified whether he dared to interfere with the people supported by such an influential organization. The auction attendant was absolutely horrified when he saw the Flonal Guild mark on the token. He abruptly began to bow in front of the blonde guy, loudly asking forgiveness for what he did not admit. Arkin clarified the man's further actions, which made him nervously bite his lip and roll his eyes. The guy with a wide smile said in the guard's ear that he had already asked him. I was asking if the big guy was ready to answer with his head. The bald man, sweating, nervously thought that he was finished, since he did not know that the guys were supported by the Flonal Guild. When Arkin patted the jock on the back, the guys began to slowly walk past him, and he still stood in a bent position. Turning to the frightened watchman, the guild employee announced that this time he forgives the man, and he began to thank him loudly. Examining the Hulk, scared to death, Theodore concluded that Arkin's stupid outfit had knocked him off his feet. The guy with a crazy look tried to realize that the blonde young man was a rather important shot in the guild. Jibra, standing behind Theodore, asked whether the employer liked the funny spectacle. Smiling and winking at the brunette, Theodore noted that the guild's employees really work professionally, which earned them their price to the last coin. Jibra grinned and answered with enthusiasm that this was not all, asking the young man to save his surprise for later. Arkin, placing his hand on the arched door, asked the boss and the employer to follow him, informing him that the show was just beginning. The trio found themselves in a richly furnished, chic, bright room with carvings and arched recesses on the walls, and in the center of the room there was a table with food. Staring straight, Theodore was greatly shocked, his eyes widened and his jaw dropped. He looked at all the magnificent elements of the hall that created its pomp. Various important people sat at a long table, and the cooks prepared dishes right in front of them, while the waiters approached each one with a tray. With her hands folded across her chest, Jibra curiously asked whether Mr. Employer was impressed with this place. A woman dressed in a chic red dress, standing in the middle of the hall with a young man in a suit, informed him about the rules of the Kargas auction. The guy, waiting, began to nervously straighten his tie. There were only 5 rules, including the starting price, the size of the bid, the total number of bids and the amount of tip. It was also indicated that one participant could not raise the bid more than 5 times, and the amount of the final bid could not exceed 10 times the cost of the lot. Having examined the sheet of rules, Theodore in the suit concluded that they were much more detailed than he thought, and Jibra in the red dress replied that it should be so, because before the rules were introduced, real battles took place here. Casting a gentle glance at the young man, the head of the department concluded that now the owners can sell their goods many times more than the market value, and buyers do not have to feverishly raise their bids to acquire these goods. Continuing to look at the rule sheet, a worried Theodore stated that it was quite difficult, and an ignorant person like him could easily create problems for himself. Jibra cast a sly squint at the guy, declaring that it would not be he who would place the bets, so Mr. Employer need not worry about anything. While Theodore was perplexed, the head of the department looked back with a soft smile at a man from the crowd who raised his hand. The crowd was bet by the blonde Arkin, holding a number in his hand and smiling with his eyes closed, because during this time he had already managed to buy the 4th book. When the bewildered Theodore was presented with the original, Jibra, laughing, asked whether the employer regretted forking out for their guild. The young man's surprise changed to admiration, and he noted that the organization clearly knows its business, thinking about rare originals that most likely will not be here. Some time had passed, and Theodore concluded that so far everything was going well, and if this continued, then by the end of the auction he would receive at least 20 books. Suddenly something pierced the guy, and he looked to the side with alarm. Theodore noticed how someone from the other side of the hall was again shamelessly staring at him. The guy looked tiredly out from behind Jibra, who noted that since the man continued to glare at his employer, he probably didn't like him. According to the guild, the bald man with a gray mustache sitting stately at the table is named Heinrich. He is a scientist who decided to devote his whole life to reading books. In the information organization they call him a book maniac, because Heinrich will not cling to every book, but if one interests him, he will do everything to take possession of it. Looking sideways at the strange man, Theodore concluded that he would have a lot of problems at the auction, and the presenter meanwhile moved on to the next lot. The man in the hat briskly announced another script, pausing before its name to create intrigue in the room. One of the Christmas tree signs in the hall rose sharply. Then the presenter was stunned to say that someone didn't even need the name, and the one who immediately doubled the price was the book maniac Heinrich. The man in the hat pointed at the scientist, stating that the initial price of the lot was 20 gold pieces, and now the man would have to pay at least 40 for it. Gibra noted with excitement that Henry's obsession with books had made itself felt, wanting to quickly find out what kind of book it was, while Theodore, meanwhile, cast a frowning glance at Mr. Arkand. The young man looked sideways at his betting assistant, asking the guild employee to be sure to buy the original and giving 200 gold pieces at his disposal. Arkand was shocked by such a huge amount, and Theodore, crossing his arms over his chest, stubbornly declared that he could not voice the reason. The young man turned to his assistant with a request to place maximum bets. The blonde guy, closing his eyes, agreed with hesitation and surprise because it was his employer's money. After the conversation, Arkand immediately raised the number, thereby increasing the bet to 60 gold. Theodore, meanwhile, was intently looking somewhere ahead while dark strands of hair fell on his face and decisively declared that he must definitely get this book. The original, for which the book maniac and the main character began to fiercely fight, was called Introduction to the Magic of Spirits, Volume 2. This book of spirit summoning magic was written by Miedelhersheim, which was another great opportunity for Theodore to talk with the great magician and ask questions that have been tormenting him since the last time they met. Concentrated, Heinrich raised the sign again and showed the judge 2 fingers, raising the bet to 80 gold. The man in the hat shouted joyfully that the price of the original was now a whopping 80 gold pieces, heightening passions. Arkand turned to Mr. Employer, asking whether the young man wanted the department employee to continue raising rates. Smiling tensely, Theodore nodded his head in agreement. After this, Arkand showed 3 fingers, and the presenter with admiration announced a new 100% rate. The man in the hat furiously declared that the blonde youth was offering as much as 100 gold pieces, so the counting began again. Hearing the report from 10 to 0, Heinrich grimaced with displeasure and raised an eyebrow questioningly, which he tried to cover up his panic, but the drops of sweat on his face gave away the man. Watching his opponent with alarm, Theodore wondered if he would raise his prices again or if he was ready to part with an even larger amount just for the sake of reading. After these thoughts of the main character, Heinrich spontaneously showed 2 fingers to the judge and raised the sign, thereby increasing the bet to 110 gold pieces. The presenter shouted loudly into the microphone, shocked that this item had just become the most expensive of the evening, wondering if there would be a daredevil who would beat the new price. Now the eyes of those gathered were directed at Arkand. Everyone expected him to up the ante. Showing 5 fingers, the blonde young man raised the bet by another 100%. The astonished presenter emotionally announced that the book was now worth a whopping 130 gold pieces, asking if any book had ever been sold for that price and concluding that it had not happened for 10 years. Sitting back on the chair, Heinrich drooped and said that nothing could be done, and the presenter said with annoyance that the old man was dropping out, adding that there was only one buyer left. Thus, the book Introduction to Spirit Magic. The second house of Miedelhersheim went to Theodore for 130 gold coins. Holding the coveted book in his hands, the protagonist stroked its cover with glee. A turquoise window popped up and said that the book contained detailed information on the 4 elements and their relationship to the spirit. Then the system informed that the work describes the principles of interaction between a magician and a spirit, including advice on controlling the power of magic circles, and also some information about the author himself appeared. The tablets reported that the level of understanding of the book is high, the class is precious, and when absorbed, the level of mastery of elemental magic will increase significantly. The signs also stated that this was an original copy written by the author himself, so that when absorbed, the affinity with the appropriate element would increase, and there was also a slight chance of gaining contact with the spirit. The system advised that the novice elementalist should increase his level of elemental magic before absorption. Holding a bag of books in his hands, Theodore turned to the voice of Gibra, who with a chuckle asked what kind of book it was and whether it was worth the money. Look down, the main character answered with a grin that of course he should, because Miedelhersheim is a real legend. Theodore couldn't miss the chance to meet the author of the book, so such a high price is more than justified. The woman interrupted the guy's thoughts, asking whether he planned to participate in the final auction, which would take place on the last day. Folding her arms across her chest, Gibber curled her mouth and said that they wouldn't sell something as cute as the original books there, and it was also very easy to offend important people from there. Theodore, thinking about the woman's words, concluded that she was right and it was better for him to refuse to participate. However, the main character decided to do the opposite, enthusiastically declaring that he wanted to participate. Taken aback, Gibra asked the guy again and, worried about the outcome of the auction, tried to dissuade her, but he asked her not to worry her so much because most likely he would have nothing to buy there. Winking at his interlocutor, Theodore put his index finger forward and stated that his intuition was telling him the need to participate. The day of the final auction arrived, which also took place in a luxurious hall. They pushed the main character from behind with a blade, not allowing him to stop. Theodore now stood in front of that most important agent of the Orcus Guild, who, towering on the steps, concluded from his appearance that the guy was an outsider. While the saber lay on the young man's back, the man in the kavuka confidently stated that he did not know how the stranger got into the local auction, but he could say one thing for sure. The mustachioed agent of the Orcus Guild gloomily concluded that Theodore had plenty of impudence. Both men cast contemptuous glances at each other, and the agent asked if the young man wanted to die. The central auction stands out among the usual ones because extremely rare artifacts are put up for auction there, and the lots here often go under the hammer for fabulous sums, and this action is known not only in Kargas, it attracts nobles from all over the world. The man in the brown cloak and white hat smiled happily when he saw a man in front of him with a box in his hand and heard that the lot called Heart of the Lake was sold to buyer number 64 for 800 gold coins. The main character sat with his fist resting his face and was horrified that the money that could have bought a couple of small estates was spent on some colorful stone. When Theodore sighed in disappointment, realizing that his financial condition was not that good, Jibra asked with a grin if the main character was happy, because she warned him that he had nothing to do here. The main character looked at Jibra, thinking about her words. Jibra explained that people who have everything always displease those who have nothing, and everything about the rich seems to be one big mockery of the poor, from their fine clothes to their words and actions. Theodore looked at the happily smiling man who bought the artifact and admitted that Jibra was right, because before the main character himself had reproached himself for not being born with talent and hated those who were luckier. A man in a light suit turned to the guests and shouted deafeningly that half of the lots had already found their owners, and the organizers had prepared something to allow the guests to unwind a little. A smiling man with a precious necklace in his hands appeared near the presenter, while the presenter said that this was the legacy of a kingdom that, for unknown reasons, had sunk into oblivion overnight. The main character became interested in the necklace and asked Gluttony if he knew anything about this thing. Theodore frowned in confusion as the magical grimoire replied that luck had been on Theodore's side lately. Gluttony said that this necklace of Princess Charlotte of the fallen kingdom of Antior is very unique because it is cursed and contains the evil of the entire nation. The main character was scared when he heard the words of a magical grimoire about a curse. Gluttony said that the necklace can transform immaterial beings, and, once under its influence, ghosts and spirits become ghosts and banshees, and in the hands of an experienced necromancer it will be no worse than a national treasure. Theodore carefully examined the jewelry with a beautiful red stone. The system reported that the necklace, which once belonged to Princess Charlotte, looks like a simple accessory, but it contains a truly terrible curse. The system also informed that absorbing this artifact requires a huge amount of mana, and when absorbed, serious damage to the mind can be caused. Theodore concluded that this necklace was extremely dangerous. The main character thought that countless hordes of invisible and harmless spirits were walking around the world, but Charlotte's necklace could turn them into extremely dangerous ghosts and banshees. Theodore frowned and came to the conclusion that if a person with evil intentions broke the seal, everything could end in disaster. The presenter said that the starting price of this accessory is 30 gold, which means that its maximum cost is not that big and will not exceed 300. The man winked and with a wide smile said that the ancient artifact was not in the best condition now, but it would make a good souvenir. When the dark man showed 2 fingers, the announcer loudly announced that number 133 was starting with the maximum bid, and the price of the lot had risen to 60 gold pieces. Viewers of the auction were surprised that the first bid was made by a representative of the Orcus Guild, and even the maximum bid from the very beginning. The main character, whose mouth was slightly open, raised his palm to his face. Theodore was nervous, pressing his hand to his mouth and indignant that it was the representatives of the Orcus Guild who had coveted the necklace. Looking at the man from Orcus, even though the necklace is cursed, its evil powers are sealed and cannot escape, and if someone else wanted to buy the artifact as a souvenir, he would not worry. Looking at the smug face of the dark man in the large white headdress, Theodore firmly decided that he was now obliged to stop the plans of the Orcus Guild. The main character brought his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and asked Gluttony why he was talking about luck, because he did not understand how the cursed object could help them. The magical grimoire frowned and angrily reminded that Theodore had once defeated ghosts in the dungeon of the Service of Death. The main character was confused while looking at Gluttony. The magical grimoire stuck out a long tongue and explained that the necklace can create ghosts, and Gluttony himself can absorb them, and this method is much more effective than searching for the originals, since the book still needs to be read and understood, and Theodore will be able to enlarge the vessel many times without extra effort. A bead of sweat ran down the protagonist's face as he delightedly thought that Charlotte's necklace would give him a break from chasing the original books. The main character watched the dark-skinned man sitting imposingly in a chair, and thought that by starting the fight for the lot, he would cross the path of the Orcus Guild. Taking on a confident expression on his face, Theodore raised his hand up. Jibra screamed in horror, not understanding what her employer was planning. The main character did not answer the girl and simply looked at her without lowering his hand. The presenter, with a voice trembling due to stupor, said that number 472 was also making the maximum bet. With a cold expression on his face, Theodore decided that he must obtain this artifact. A man with red hair and a long mustache raised his head and looked contemptuously at the main character. Guild agent Orcus frowned, looking at the main character with orange eyes and calling him impudent. The man continued to look at Theodore, doubting that he would be able to carry out his plan. The main character sat motionless, and Jibra put her palm to her forehead when a man in long light clothes reached for a long golden sword. The accompanying guild representative, Orcus, pointed his weapon at Theodore and rudely asked what he was doing. The main character, with irritation on his face, replied that he was participating in the auction. The man brought the sword closer to the protagonist's face and said that he was clearly a stranger. The man took the weapon away and turned away, saying that he didn't know how Theodore got into the action, but he couldn't exactly be called a coward. Guild agent Orcus furrowed his eyebrows with hostility, asking if the main character was going to die young. Theodore remained silent in response, looking at the man with anger. The man pulled back his red mustache and thoughtfully said that they pointed a blade at the main character, but he didn't even flinch, which means Theodore is not so simple. While the main character was getting up from the colorful sofa, the man with a gun in his hand decided that the main character wanted to grab more money and began to offer him any money so that the young man would not take this necklace. The main character turned to a man sitting in the distance and said that he wanted to get this particular necklace. The man frowned with displeasure and even twitched when he heard such a statement. When the guild agent asked if Theodore was going to withdraw his bid even after such concessions from Orcus, the protagonist, who had a sword pointed at his back, confirmed this. The man frowned, dissatisfied that the main character was not afraid of the representative of the Orcus guild and wanted to give Theodore one last piece of advice. The man ordered the main character to forget about the necklace, and the room was filled with black smoke. The main character stood motionless while the attacks were rapidly approaching him, and Gluttony was unhappy that some pathetic non-entity was interrupting his sleep. The magical grimoire with an angry face told Agent Orcus to use at least the evil eye of valor if he wanted to deal with the owner of this body. Theodore opened his mouth in surprise when the black smoke dissipated and did not touch him, but flew past him. Guild Agent Orcus's face twisted in fear as his own attacks changed direction and began to approach him. The man let out a heart-rending cry of pain as streams of smoke pierced his eyes and turned them black. The man rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands while his subordinate excitedly asked if he was okay. Covering his face with his fingers, the guild representative Orcus opened one eye, which turned red, and called out to Theodore. The man, who had fallen from his chair and pressed his hand to one eye, screamed shrilly, asking the main character what he had done to him. The guild representative Orcus screamed heart-rendingly, pressing his fingers to his face. The man was horrified and bewildered that not only did the demonic eye not work, but he also received a retaliatory blow. The man looked at Theodore with a red eye, not understanding who he was. The guild representative grinned angrily, revealing white teeth. The man, who was grimacing in pain, said that they would have to decide everything through a duel of bets if the main character did not want to give up the necklace. The main character furrowed his eyebrows, widened his eyes, and opened his mouth, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. When Theodore wanted to know about the betting match, the representatives of the Orcus Guild turned around and angrily replied that they had nothing more to talk about. The mustachioed man, whose eyes had returned to normal, looked at Theodore with hostility and declared that in 3 days he would personally beat the crap out of the young man. The main character looked at the men leaving and did not understand what was happening. Theodore let out a startled sigh and jerked when Jibra appeared next to him and asked very loudly how it went. The main character said that the agent announced a betting match for him and then simply left. Jibra screamed even louder that Theodore was crazy and that she had said to avoid the fight by any means necessary. The bidding duel is an additional rule exclusively for underground auctions of Kargas, and it comes into force when the price of the lot reaches its maximum and both buyers do not want to give in to each other. Both contenders must find a warrior to fight, and the one whose fighter wins takes the lot. Jibra looked dejectedly at Theodore and said that she did not question his skills, but the buyers were not allowed to participate in the duel themselves. When the girl asked why it was necessary to accept the challenge at all, the main character answered with a question whether he just needed to choose a fighter for himself. Jibra frowned and replied that nothing would come of it, because anyone who agreed to represent Theodore would become an enemy of the Orcus Guild, and no madman would dare to do that. Jibra froze with a shocked expression on her face as the protagonist said with a smirk and a raised eyebrow that there was nothing to worry about because he had already found his fighter. When the girl asked if the main character was serious, he confirmed this and said that the fighter should be told that they would meet a little earlier. An excited Jibra said that the bodyguard of the Orcus Guild agent is a black knight, completely clad in black steel armor, and he overpowered the armored knight, cutting him into 2 halves. When the girl asked whether Theodore's fighter would be able to compete with such power, the main character smiled and told Jibra not to worry. The main character assured that there would be problems if the Black Knight was at the master level, but in other cases, Theodore's fighter would win without any doubt. People in raincoats and long robes walked along the stands of the large arena. A man with a black pattern on his forehead thoughtfully put his palm to his mouth, saying that there had been no betting fights for a long time, and a man sitting next to him with a scar on his face, dressed in orange clothes, clarified that during the last fight, which was 5 years ago, Duke Saldan took the elixir with the hands of the King of Mercenaries. The audience agreed that this time the fight will definitely not be boring, since this time an agent of the Orcus Guild named Isaac is taking part in it. The wooden grate moved upward, revealing access to a knight in black and red armor. The knight entered the arena, a 2-handed black sword hung on his back. The spectators looked at the man with fear, not believing that this was really the same Black Knight. The men, looking at the Black Knight, concluded that an aura of greatness emanated from him, as if from a block of stone without vulnerable points, but at the same time no life was felt in him. The crowd of spectators screamed deafeningly when they saw Isaac with the Black Knight. The main character, dressed in a white suit, looked at Isaac with his hands in his trouser pockets. Theodore, next to whom Gibra stood, said that 3 days had passed, and Isaac, seeing that the main character had not escaped, said that he never ceases to amaze him. Theodore replied with a grin that you couldn't tell from the man's face. Isaac frowned maliciously, saying that the impudence of the main character had not gone away either. A girl with short white hair and a red beret said with a smile that it was time to start, and asked whether Isaac was represented by a Black Knight. Then the girl turned to Theodore and Gibra and asked with excitement which warrior the young man represented. The main character said quietly that his fighter had just arrived. A dark-haired young man wearing a white shirt walked into the arena with his hands in his black pants pockets. It was Randolph, commander of the Wandering Wolves mercenary group. The main character was thinking that a few days ago he accidentally found Randolph's name in the supporter register. Theodore reflected that he would not have decided to take the choice if it were not for Randolph, and that the young man had some connection with him and his younger sister Rebecca. The audience, seeing Randolph, began to say that Theodore's representative did not look strong. The main character raised his hand to his face, sticking out one finger. Randolph approached the Black Knight, asking if this tin was his opponent. The red-eyed presenter, blushing with embarrassment, asked Randolph to introduce himself. The man winked, apologized for his lack of manners, and said his name. While the Black Knight and Randolph looked at each other, the presenter said that the main thing in a betting duel is the will of the participant for whom the warrior is fighting. And even if the fighter is no longer able to fight, the last word remains with the employer. Randolph chuckled, said that he liked these harsh conditions, and asked the Black Knight if he was ready to die. The Black Knight ignored Randolph and reached for the sword behind his back. Randolph thought about how the Black Knight seemed empty, which made the man somehow feel uncomfortable around him. Randolph decided it didn't matter and picked up the rope. While the Black Knight was still drawing his huge sword, Randolph was already approaching him with incredible speed. Randolph stood right in front of the Black Knight and kicked his sword powerfully. The next moment, Randolph jumped, leaning on the Black Knight's shoulders and holding the rope in both hands. The man jumped to the ground and pulled the rope that wrapped around the Black Knight's neck. Suddenly, the Black Knight struck Randolph. The man flew high into the air while the Black Knight stood on the ground with his sword raised. Randolph bared his teeth, looking at his opponent with fear in his yellow eyes. Randolph landed opposite the Black Knight, who took a fighting pose. Randolph frowned in confusion, not understanding why he couldn't feel the Black Knight's breath. Looking at the Black Knight, the man thought that it's not that he's holding his breath, because this creature literally doesn't breathe. Randolph raised the corner of his lips and told Theodore that it seemed they had been lured into a trap. The main character was horrified by the hidden voice technique and asked why Randolph thought so. Randolph, without taking his frightened eyes off the Black Knight, explained to Theodore that this pile of metal had haunted him from the very beginning because he did not react to pain, and there was no heartbeat or breathing. When the main character asked what Randolph was getting at, the man replied that the Black Knight was undead. Theodore frowned at the knight in armor, realizing that most likely Randolph was right, because during the battle with the Ancient Lick, he personally defeated the ancestor turned into undead. Afterwards, the main character concluded that even though the dead man was not a high-ranking Death Knight, it is unlikely that they are somehow fundamentally different, so Randolph's premonition can be trusted. Grabbing the hilts of the red swords, the mercenary praised himself sarcastically, because he rushed to this place without any preparation, only after hearing the news about his sister. With his blades ready, Randolph confidently declared that he owed Theodore anyway, so he could finally repay his past misdeeds. Theodore watched the concentrated red-haired man, noting his terrifying aura and not believing that he could achieve such a level of skill in a year. Randolph lunged with his feet, extending his red blades to the sides and not taking his eyes off the undead opponent. Isaac's subordinates looked at the sword master with alarm, anticipating something serious. Theodore cast a dark glance at his good friend, who was a swordsman known throughout the continent as Randolph Lightning Blade. The red-haired man, who was now quickly rushing towards the enemy, raising rings of dust behind him, was known for his speed of movement, far exceeding human perception. Randolph circled around and came to an abrupt stop directly in front of the armored undead, leaving a trail of dust behind him. After this, the man flew up to the enemy, striking him with sharp blows with his blades. The armored knight's eyes glowed red furiously as he received blows. The next moment he was already raising his spear, deciding to make a retaliatory attack, and Randolph prepared for it, putting his sword forward. When the armored man started swinging his spear, Randolph had no trouble ducking down with his quick reaction time. After that, the man leaned on the hilt of the sword stuck in the ground, concluding that in terms of brute force he was losing, while dust swirled around him. Standing on one knee, Randolph gripped his sword tightly to make another attack, and saw a significant advantage in himself. When the man, holding out his red blades to the sides, began to run furiously towards the frozen enemy, he concluded that he would never be able to keep up with him. All the spectators were amazed at Randolph's inhuman speed and sat wide-eyed in admiration. Jibra, who was next to Theodore, noted that the guy's friend was quite talented and decided to find out where the employer met such a skilled fencer. After the question, the brunette turned to the woman and with a sly look declared that he would not tell, and she curled her lips with dissatisfaction. Offended by this attitude, the head of the guild branch looked at her interlocutor in shock, her mouth open when he told her to just watch. Now Theodore was sure that during this year Randolph, who was now flying towards the enemy on the battlefield, had become much stronger, but he had not yet become a master. Skillfully dodging the blows of the undead, the red-haired man flew ahead to attack the formidable enemy, and the main character concluded that the most important thing left for the mercenary was to awaken the aura skill. The aura skill is a unique ability of a sword master, a power that sometimes surpasses even the greatest magic. Remembering Randolph's fight with the undead in the dungeon, the main character explained that someone can destroy space, someone can control gravity, and someone becomes invisible. There are as many aura abilities as there are swordsmen in the world, but only real sword masters can awaken them. As Randolph furiously struck the armored knight, Theodore concluded that if the man had such an ability, he would have ended the fight long ago. The mercenary flew forward, and red streaks emanating from the blades remained in the air from his blows, and the main character, meanwhile, came to the conclusion that so far the advantage is on the side of his friend, but he is fighting with a high-ranking Death Knight, so now any mistake can cost his life. After Randolph dealt a powerful blow to the dead man and now stood in the distance, bent over, pieces of chopped armor flew into the air.